What's going on, everybody? Welcome to this week's Lumix Live. This is definitely one of the ones I've been waiting to do for a while now that the GH6 is shipping more broadly. And yeah, we wanted to just devote an entire stream to questions that all of you have. Obviously, we've answered a lot of questions over the last couple of weeks, but there's kind of a difference between, the questions that lead up to, before you get the camera in your hand versus when you actually get it and you start playing around with it and finding questions that are unique to your particular way that you work with the camera. So I thought now would be the perfect time. The camera is shipping in many different regions, especially here in the United States. We've just begun shipping back on the 15th. And yeah, this is really just going to be kind of a big overall, just large Q&A. A couple things I want to get out of the way before we jump right into the conversation is if you have a question about the camera and you want me to address it on air, make sure to tag at LUMIX cameras before the question so I can see it in the chat. It just makes it easier for me to go through and identify the questions. If I don't see that at LUMIX cameras before it, I apologize if I missed your question. But I do review these after the stream while I'm putting in the chapters. So I'll be able to go through, take a look at it, and address it in a future stream. After this particular week, we're probably going to take a little bit of a break talking about the GH6, go back to some of the other kind of conversations about some of the other cameras, the S5 in particular. So yeah, after this, we'll be able to, kind of get some more conversations going. I want to remind everybody about LUMIX Pro Services. We have this available in many different regions across the globe. In the United States, we have two variants available. We have LUMIX Pro Services Red and LUMIX Pro Services Platinum. The Red tier is free to get access to. So if you're someone who just picked up a GH6, you're going to want to go over and take advantage of the LUMIX Pro Services Red, especially here in the United States. This is how you get the free Lexar 128 gig CF Express card. You can also go, if you're in the United States, again, you can go to lumixgh6.com. That will handle US customers. Overseas, if you're in different regions, take a look at your local Panasonic region to see which site you go to claim your CF Express card. Aside from the free level of LUMIX Pro Service, which you get your 3-year warranty here in the United States, we do have the Platinum tier. The Platinum tier is really designed for those that want that extra little bit of protection on your equipment, and you want to make sure that any downtime is minimized while you've got your equipment. So details can be found at the links that we have, either using the QR code for the US site, or following the link that's down in the description and what I just dropped into the chat to take a look at LUMIX Pro Service in your region. Some of the cool things that go along with it, I've said this for the last 2.5 years that we've been doing these streams. 3-year manufacturer warranty in the Red series and in the Platinum series. Platinum series gets you member exclusive hotline, really cool welcome gift, and discounts on out-of-warranty repairs as well as sensor cleanings, EVFs, loaner equipment, things like that, should you have to use the service. So, now that that's out of the way, let me close these tabs. I want to bring to the attention of everybody that there was just a firmware update posted for the GH6 yesterday. This is it's a more minor little firmware update, so it's nothing that's going to be ultra groundbreaking at this current state. It specifically deals with the high resolution shot mode and some just image tweaking that was done to work with the current raw developing software that is available on the market. So if you've got your camera, definitely get it updated. This way you're ready as raw support becomes more widely accepted through the different manufacturers. And just to get it out of the way, I don't have updates as to when Adobe or any other company is going to be adding the camera to their update service. But just know that typically raw support, especially when you're working with a new sensor and a new processor, so it's an entirely new file that comes out of the camera, typically can take a little bit of time. So just kind of hang in there. In the meantime, SilkyPix is the free software that we give away with the camera. If you look in your user manual, there is a link that you can follow to actually go download this software for your systems. And I'm dropping a link in the chat right now, which is actually to all of the user manuals. So this is the link that you can follow in the actual hard copy user manual if you want. But this way you can actually get the PDF or an HTML version of it, and you can search it. If you open that up and search for SilkyPix, you'll get the link where you can download the software for the camera. Let's see here. So there's that. There's the firmware update. Didn't want to close that tab. Let me reopen that. Yeah, so firmware update, that's available. I did drop that link. Cool. So, as we said at the beginning, if you have your questions, drop it with @LUMIX Cameras before it, and I'll be able to start going through them. So, let's start right at the top. This question was actually dropped in before the stream started, and this question came from Michael. And the question is, on your GH6, I want to use different photo style settings for photo and video, say standard for photo, vlog for video. Is there any way to do this without changing it every time I switch the modes on the camera? And that's a really good question. And we've talked about it a couple of times on these streams, how you can actually get in and set the camera up so that in creative movie mode, everything is totally separated from the photography mode. So I've got my GH6 hooked up here, and the way you're going to do this is go into the camera menu, and then you're going to go into the wrench setting, or actually the custom cog or gear setting, which is custom setup. And then you're going to go into the second page of the image quality tab. This is where you're going to find an option that's called Creative Video Combined Set. When you go into this, this allows you to change all of these icons to the camcorder icon. Now, what that will do is set it up so that things like your aperture, shutter speed, ISO, exposure compensation settings are independent of each other between photo and video. Same with white balance, photo styles, metering modes, and even the AF modes. So if you're someone who bounces back and forth between the photo and the video side of the GH6, that's probably one of the biggest things to set up right out of the box. The camera will fully operate as like kind of two individual cameras in one. This makes it so you're not having to power cycle the camera to get into a photo or a video mode, but all your settings can stay independent of each other depending on which mode you actually want to use. So let's see here. The next question was about CF Express cards. And following a lot of the conversation over on Facebook and Reddit, and even some of the conversations that we've had here on Lumix Live, there's been a lot of questions about, you know, which cards work, which cards can you use with the camera, and it's fairly simple from our side. We have published a list of the CF Express cards that we've been able to validate as of today, that they work with the camera, and any caveats that come along with those particular cards. So the link that I'm dropping in the chat right now, this is to our global support site, which lists out the memory cards that you can look at, what their status is, whether or not we're recommending them for photography or for stills, or for video, and then any kind of caveats that are found in our testing with those particular cards. So as of right now, today is the 17th, so happy St. Patrick's Day, happy St. Patrick's Day to those that celebrate it. As of today, right now, the Lexar CF Express Type B cards that we are providing with the pre-orders of the camera, those have been validated to work in the test environments that we've set up for the camera. So far, since day one of me using this camera, I've never had a single issue with that card. The other card that is validated without any issues is the actual Panasonic branded CF Express Type B cards. And that's a 128 or 256. Lexar has up to a 512 gig variant of that card as well. All of those have been tested and validated for video recording. The most recent addition is the SanDisk Extreme Pro CF Express Type B cards. So from 128 to 512 gigs are validated to work for video. The 64 gig is not validated for video, so you want to kind of avoid that card in particular. But with the rest of the cards, there is a note about potential issues where that card may stop recording even if the camera's not hot. And a lot of this really kind of comes down to the new adoption in the industry of CF Express. It's a different kind of media than SD cards. CF Express cards do run warmer than traditional media cards that we typically see. And for those that work on like custom PC building and that side, think of this as like NVMe SSDs that you use in modern PC building. They get really warm, and typically they need to be cooled somehow, whether it's thermal pads or something like that. Well, CF Express Type B cards are relatively similar. So as heat is generated, write speeds drop. Most cards that are that we validated, so that Lexar and the Panasonic card, they've passed where even as the card gets warmer, they're still maintaining the required minimum speeds with it, based on whatever tables the companies use to kind of throttle things if they have to. But what was found is that some of those SanDisk cards do stop recording as they get warm. Even if the camera's not hot and you're not seeing any kind of thermal issue on the camera at all. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you're looking at that, and that's most likely going to be seen in the really high bitrate modes where you're running tons of data through it. So ultimately, with any card, even if you're looking at something outside of what our recommendations are, make sure you do tests before you actually go out into say like a paid gig. Make sure that you're testing your equipment and you understand how everything works before you go out there. The cards that we list are the ones that we've tested. It's by no means an ending list. We are continually working and testing and validating cards. So as more information comes out and as more cards get added to that list, this is the site that will be updated for it. So with CF Express cards, take a look what's available. Like I said, the Lexar cards that we're giving away with the camera have been awesome to work with, especially with just how fast these cards are for offloading footage. It's pretty nice. Let's see here. Next question was, 24 Hertz mode has 48 frames per second in 5.7K and 4.4K, but not in Cinema 4K or DCI, UHD, or 1080p. Is this possibly an addition in a future firmware update? I have actually asked this question when I saw this come in right before the stream. At this point, I don't have an answer for you particularly. But it is something that we will get asked over to the engineers if there's a reason why. Some little things like that can come down to either standards or just not being a commonly used frame rate and aspect ratio. But it is something that we will bring up. That's not saying that it's going to be added. It's not saying that it's out for a particular reason. But it is something that we will bring over to our team and see if we can get you an answer. Let's see here. Hi from southern Spain. When the IBIS is off, is the sensor fixed, or is it in a magnetic field and susceptible to vibrations such as the GH5? So the in-body stabilization system in the vast majority of cameras that are out that use a magnetic system for this, when you are turning the system off, you are suspending the sensor in the magnetic field. Some cameras have stronger magnetic fields. Typically, when you start seeing higher compensation capabilities, usually means that the stabilization effect and the magnetic field is much stronger than some of the older, earlier iterations of these cameras. That being said, it's one of the reasons why a camera like the GH5S or the box cameras exist. There are certain circumstances where that was an odd way to pronounce that, circumstances where you want a camera that has a hard-mounted sensor to reduce any possibility of the sensor being kind of jiggled a little bit, even though you've got that magnetic field holding it in place. In the testing I've done, I haven't really seen much of a challenge with it, but I also don't hardcore test the cameras that way. I've tried mounting cameras to my motorcycle, but I don't have the proper dampening systems just for how much a motorcycle vibrates versus, say, something like a car. And it's not really my direct kind of expertise. So what I'd say is that it's definitely better than a GH5 when it comes to how stable the sensor is when it's turned off for things like attaching to motor vehicles. But it is still floating in a magnetic field. So if you impart a strong enough force on whatever it is the camera's attached to, you could get a little bit of a warp there. But that's going to be the same situation for any camera that's got an in-body stabilizer. To my knowledge, I don't think anyone has a hard physical lock when you disengage a stabilization system. So yeah, that's kind of how it is right now. Let's see here. Couple questions. FC, with dynamic range boost, is there a need for HDR? Is there a need for HDR photos? If so, how close is DR boost to HDR? Also, DR boost on in video equals HDR video? Question mark. So I think this is more of a question and more of a kind of current status of video and stills recording, where the common thought of what HDR is versus what you're trying to capture in the camera are starting to blend pretty close to each other. Just because the camera allows for DR boost, and this is one of the modes you can turn on that gives you 13 plus stops of dynamic range, primarily in the highlights and cleaner shadows, doesn't mean that that footage has to be destined for HDR. HDR is going to be your editing process. Are you going to deliver for an HDR output? Are you going to flag that footage properly? What are your highlights being rated to? How are you exposing that footage? So DR boost makes HDR content much easier, especially if you're shooting in things like ProRes, where it's just easier to work with the footage in post, for the most part. So DR boost will help. It doesn't mean that it's inherently HDR footage. It's just getting more dynamic range available to you, so that even if you're outputting an SDR project, or something in Rec 709, you've got more latitude to work with in that file. When it comes to the stills side of the camera, this is where I'd say it gets even a little more complicated than this, because modern cameras have gotten so good at how much dynamic range a still RAW file has, and how much you can push and pull those images when you're working in post. So while in some cases, yes, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to do the traditional way of shooting 3 exposures and then combining there, which is still an incredibly valid way to shoot HDR, because you get even more dynamic range that way when you're compositing an image. Inherently, you're going to get some really solid dynamic range out of it. And it depends on, I guess, what you classify or what you consider HDR photos or video to be. Yeah, it's not really a clear-cut answer. While a lot of modern cameras are starting to remove things like the JPEG HDR, that really more comes down to the fact that the camera inherently has more dynamic range now, even in JPEGs, than what those older 3-shot modes typically would produce if you're only working in JPEG. And you still have some pretty good latitude with it. But yeah, you just get a couple different options with the files now, because they're that much more robust. Let's see here. Hey there, I just bought and received a GH6 and noticed that I cannot shoot in 8-bit VFR. Will this be supported in later updates? Thanks in advance. So yeah, the GH6 is primarily a 10-bit camera. You have to go all the way into the MP4 recording options. That's not the rec file format. You have to go into the MP4 recording options to find the, I believe it's 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5 8-bit recording options that are available in the camera. When you have these options selected, and my screen's going to go dark because I changed the frame rate on it. If I come out into the menu, you see that yes, 8-bit, not available there. And it's because it's set to a 4208-bit file. If I change the camera back into MOV and wait for the camera to cycle back, I can go into my recording options, click display filtering, come down here, turn variable frame rate on. You'll see that I have 18 options, and all of these options can now be used for variable frame rate recording. If you go all the way down to full HD 24p, and again, wait for this to change. Excuse me. I can then come into my variable frame rate, turn it on, and this is how I can get all the way up to my 300 frames per second. So, realistically, with variable frame rate, 10-bit has gotten pretty easy to work with, since we work within the standards that are most commonly supported by graphics card acceleration and native acceleration in Mac. So, yeah, it's going to be able to, it's going to produce a better VFR experience anyway in 10-bit. So we can ask about 8-bit, but yeah, it's kind of just 10-bit. Let's see here. Does the GH6 have settings for inbuilt live streaming? So right now, no. I don't know if that's something that can be added to the camera or if it is going to be added to the camera. But the more we hear comments like this, the more we can feed back to our engineers to see about adding things like that in future updates. So keep those comments coming, and we'll always keep passing them into our engineering team. Let's see here. Alan asks, Alan is the next question. So Alan asks, which lenses are best to use with the 100 megapixel high resolution mode? So, any of them, honestly. I've tested with the vast majority of our Micro Four Thirds lenses, and I get stunning results out of each one. We don't limit what lenses you can use with different modes in this camera. So high resolution mode is going to work with pretty much any lens. The thing that I believe gets maybe a little confused about how high resolution mode works and the concept of getting a 100 megapixel image out of it is that you're not recording a 100 megapixel image right out of the lens. So lens resolution isn't actually the determining point here. You're recording 8 or 16 25 megapixel images that then are being software compiled together to create that 100 megapixel image. So any lens that we make is going to be perfectly fine to capture your high resolution mode. Some will be sharper than others because some lenses are just inherently sharper than others out there. Typically, I love shooting with my 15mm, my 12mm, the 42.5 Nocticron. I've done some handheld high res with the 200mm 2.8. And I've gotten awesome results out of it. So, yeah, it is really any lens can work pretty solid with it. So, yeah, not really any one particular. Just whichever one works best for your field of view and the way you like to shoot. Let's see here. How can we capture audio in slow motion modes? So this is a little bit of a different way to work with the cameras. So variable frame rate, which has traditionally been the way that we do slow motion effects in the GH series cameras, and even in the G series, we just call it high res or high speed mode. With these cameras, you actually record the native frame rates. So if you are working with the GH6 and you set it into 48 frames per second, 120 or 240 frame, the camera will record audio. So you're going to be getting the audio file attached to that. The way this changes versus the previous ways that we've worked with high-speed filming is that you have to manually slow the footage down in your software of choice. So that gets you your audio file attached to it. VFR function still doesn't record audio with it. You do get push AF or one-shot AF before you start recording, so you can focus into the point, start recording, and then your manual focus after that. So any mode that is variable frame rate or VFR, there's no audio. Any mode that's HFR or high frame rate offers the ability to record audio. And it's just as simple as click record and you're good to go. Let's see here. Wow. Okay. Battle for Freedom. Does the GH6 or S5 give you access to download Kairos Live video processing software? I don't think so. That will be a question that I have to ask with Matt. I'm fairly certain it doesn't. Kairos is one of our, well, at least I believe is what you're referencing. Kairos is one of our broadcast solutions. So I don't think that there's the communication between those two. Let's see here. Jake asks, this is GH6 related, but I'm curious if LUMIX S Pro zoom lenses are parfocal. They are, we have what's called electronically parfocal or electronically assisted parfocal with our lenses, with a vast majority of our lenses now. So the way you test that, for those that don't know, zoom all the way in to the tightest, set focus, zoom out, and as you zoom in and out after you've set your distance focus, the lens will maintain that focus as you zoom with it. Yeah, so the vast majority of them should be there. Let's see here. Is HDMI latency reduced when you disable HDMI audio pass-through? I believe HDMI latency does decrease when you turn off HDMI audio out. So, yeah, simple answer. Let's see here. The manual says SD cards up to V90. Could you give us a simplified guide on how good a card you need primarily for still shooters who occasionally record 4K? So at the link that I dropped earlier in the chat that goes to the card recommendations, we have SD card recommendations there as well. Truthfully, this will be a different train of thought for everyone that you ask. I'm a firm believer of buy the correct cards, don't cheap out on media. You can get some really good screaming deals on inexpensive SD and CF Express cards out there, but you don't know what their quality assurance is. You don't know if they're actually maintaining to the specifications that the associations involved with each of those formats have set in place. So buying quality cards from reputable manufacturers, from reputable dealers, is a hill I'm willing to just kind of stand and leave it on. That being said, V90 SD cards are still the highly recommended media cards for the cameras. The benefit for a stills photographer, while not necessarily inherent while you're shooting, is really kind of more on the offloading side. When you're taking the card out, putting it in a computer, and you want to offload your images. V90 SD cards have much faster read-write speeds for connecting them into your computer, as well as some of the benefits you get in camera. So I still highly recommend V90 cards for pretty much anything you shoot, even if you're a still shooter. Yes, they're more expensive, but I typically find the trade-off is I don't want to wait a whole bunch of time offloading an entire night's worth of shooting. I'd rather be able to just throw the card in and within a couple of minutes have all that footage off onto my SSDs. So yeah, at that link, we have a list of Panasonic, ProGrade, Sony, and SanDisk cards that have been validated with the camera, and some notes as to which ones to look for within those, since some cards have variations over time. You can go V60 in most of the cameras. With the GH6, V60 can be fine in the GH6. However, the caveat there being that as you start going up higher in bit rate, that means that the card has to be sticking closer to the actual tolerances that are set for the specifications. V60 may work fine for one person, but they may not really be pushing that codec. V90 is going to be the one that's recommended to go with when it comes to video shooting. So, yeah, go with V90. If I'd known about the GH5S coming, I would have waited instead of buying a GH5. How far out is a GH6S? So we don't comment on future development of product. Yeah, GH6 is the current camera, and yeah, that's the one that we've got. Let's see here. Whoa, thank you, YouTube. Jumping comments again. There it goes. All right. Is it possible to get VFR frame rates higher than 300 frames per second in 720p or 480 in future firmware updates? I know the quality wouldn't be as good in those settings, but it would be fun for science. So some of those questions can definitely... I see where some of the VFR, higher frame rate questions come in. One of the things that I think everyone may not understand or really may not realize is that image quality does have a bar that it has to hit. If going to those frame rates drops below that bar, it's not going to get added. And going into lower resolutions, higher frame rates, you start either having to go into things like more line skipping, stuff like that, and the image quality tends to just really kind of drop dramatically. Some cameras that shoot at really high frame rates that are not like Phantoms, the image quality just doesn't really look that great. And to do something that doesn't meet the image quality bar is just not something you're typically going to see. If it were to meet the image quality bar, that's a different story. But the vast majority of times when you look at really high frame rates in lower resolutions, usually the quality is just not comparable to what the camera's able to offer normally. So that means if you're trying to mix footage, it becomes just not that great of a file to work with. So we can ask, but I wouldn't think that you'd see really higher frame rates unless we were able to get them to an image quality bar that we've set. Let's see here. Can the engineers add just a few more VFR options? I have a camera in 4K 24, for example, and I can only do 28, 36, 48, and 60. Would love to see 32, 42, or a manual selector for any FPS. I can ask them. I think a lot of the frame rates get tied to what can be processed and worked into the final output frame rate. So it's usually integers, which is what ends up working. But we'll ask. How would you go about removing the camera door? I notice... how would you go about removing the camera door? I noticed it's nothing like previous GH. Not all of my dummy coupler batteries can fit through this new type of hole. So one thing, don't remove the battery door. If you break it, that's not something that we cover if you need to get it fixed. And truthfully, I would never trust using anything that's third party when it comes to battery power solutions unless it is something that is within a standard. The reason I say that is USB power delivery, so USB PD, is a standard. It is something that is tested, it's controlled, so there are things that have to be in place for a device to be USB PD compatible. External DCC couplers that don't fit the camera, yeah, I cannot in good faith ever recommend things like that. We make the actual adapters for the camera, the DCC couplers and the AC adapters, the AC10, and I believe it's the DCC17, I think is the one for the GH6. Yeah, the DCC17. And if you use the right stuff, it's gonna fit properly. Yeah, first red flag warning is it doesn't fit, don't use it. Because, yeah, if it damages the camera, we don't cover that for manufacturer warranty. Let's see here. Where were we? Any insight on how auto shutter decides mechanical versus electronic? Does it take panning into account? Does it typically use electronic shutter to mechanical when panning to minimize banding? So I assume this is when you're in the camera and you say you're in the photography mode. So we'll change this over to photo. If I'm in here and then I go to my shutter type, you'll see that we have a number of options: auto, mechanical, electronic first curtain, fully electronic, or electronic plus noise reduction. The auto mode, I believe, really what it does is it just sets it so that if I raise my shutter speed above the mechanical, it'll drop to electronic. Years ago, and you can see that being indicated there. So 8,000 is 8,000th of a second is the fastest mechanical shutter. You go to 10,000, then it changes to electronic. The other area where auto will activate is in situations which have become so minimal to where it's not really ever any issue these days anymore. Basically, the camera can drop into electronic shutter if it detects that you're in the right combination to possibly, maybe, potentially cause shutter shock, which is something that older shutter designs used to deal with. Modern shutter designs have got around this for the vast majority of times, but the auto will use that in certain circumstances. Outside of that, it's not really going to do anything to change, like when you're panning or something like that. You would go in and change it to whichever mode you want. Luckily, the readout on the GH6 definitely has much lower instances of rolling shutter, so you can use electronic shutter for more types of shooting than you could with previous electronic shutter layouts because of the sensor hardware. So yeah, let's see here. More questions. Just a reminder, if you have questions, tag at Lumix Camera so I can see it. Down here, how does the dynamic range of raw stills look like on the GH6? Should we expect the DR boost effect also in stills to push the image much higher in raw formats? Yes. So DR boost does work in the photo modes. It's done automatically, so it's not anything you have to do or turn on or turn off. And it does increase the overall quality of the image, I guess is a good way to put it. One of the things that you'll notice is that the file sizes on the GH6, especially in RAW, are larger than what we've had in previous 20 megapixel cameras, and even in the GH5S, which is a 14-bit RAW file. The GH6 outputs a 16-bit container, and you'll see some file sizes change as you're shooting. So yeah, when DR boost does get used in the image, because it will intelligently select when it needs to use it, when it doesn't need to use it, yeah, the file sizes are larger, and the actual image quality you get out of it and the amount that you can push and pull the image is much greater than what you've seen in the previous 20 megapixel images. So yeah, let's see here. Can the engineers also add false color? We've asked. I know Matt Fraser and I are definitely supporters of we'd love to see false color added in. We'll keep asking. Let's see here. Speaking of USB PD, I noticed there are 18 watt and 30 watt types. Do both work with the GH6? So that is a great question. And actually, to answer that, right on that support page, we also have a list of tested USB-C PD compatible devices. Right now, the site didn't get updated yet with the GH6 yet, because obviously still things are being worked on and validated. But the core thing that you need to look for when it comes to USB power delivery is it has to state that it has 9 volt, 3 amp. Higher watt hour USB powered USB devices, which I thought I had one sitting on my desk. I don't. It's charging. Some of them do have higher watt hour, but not all of the higher watt hour have that particular mode of operation. So 9 volt, 3 amp. In the end, make sure that it clearly states that it supports 9 volt 3 amp, and you're good to go. Typically, it's going to be USB-C to C, so A to C doesn't support 9 volt 3 amp. So yeah, just make sure that you've got C to C. Let's see here. Robert says, is the G9 done with its update life cycle? Lol, B-raw chances. Well, I don't know if the G9 is done with its update cycle. You're probably not going to see B-raw on a camera like that. That's still primarily a photography-based camera. And the typical 20 megapixel sensors from that generation don't have RAW support. So yeah, you probably won't see it. Let's see here. Can we get an abort button for now writing please wait message? I tried burst shooting in RAW to an SD card and it disables the camera until its writing is done. I mean, I understand what the question is, but I don't think you'd be able to, or in the most scenarios, I don't think you'd want that, because if you were to shoot a burst and then accidentally click that abort button, all those files are gone. You wouldn't have them anymore. I can check. If we go into playback, look at the playback menu. Hope if I had my camera here. So there is an option to do. So this is video, timestamp, protect rating, video divide, deleting images, date, time, LUT previews. Yeah, so basically in the current setup now, there's not a way to like kind of abort the file writing for the camera. Let's see here. Would it be possible to get a prereq function like the old Panasonic ENG style cameras in a GH body? I don't know. Honestly, we can definitely ask and push to see if it's something that can be done to get pre-roll in the camera. I do know that with cameras like this that have much larger sensors than typical ENG style cameras or traditional camcorders, pre-roll or pre-record does generate a ton more heat because you're constantly writing and reading that footage. And by writing, I mean it has to write that information to the buffer. So it's possible that maybe it can be done, but as of right now, I believe it's probably more of a keeping thermal in check. But yeah, we would be able to ask and see if it's something that they could do. Let's see here. Solid Mind Productions. In the B&H GH6 live stream, Matt mentioned that when using the GH6 with an RS2, the tracking works without Raven eyes. Can you provide more info on this and any other GH6 RS2 features? Yes, so the RS2 and the RSC2, so the carbon fiber one and then the kind of little bit lower end one, which I have one sitting up on my shelf back there. When you plug the camera in over USB-C into the camera control port on the gimbal, you can use the tracking system or the active track system without the need of adding in the Raven Eyes adapter. The way this works is you put the camera into the full area tracking, so body tracking, and it uses the trajectory information that we're using to work with our body and AF system to tell the gimbal where it needs to move the head. It's as simple as that. On an RS2, or on an RSC2, so the smaller one, when you have everything connected and you've got the camera in the full area, so 315 points on this camera, when you have it in that mode and a body is detected or a face is detected, position the frame the way you want it and then pull the trigger once on the gimbal and it will toggle active track. I believe on the RS2, because that has the full interface, you would just activate it the same way you would normally. I think you can do it with the trigger. And then, yeah, it sets it up and you're good to go. Pretty simple and straightforward. Outside of that, you'd have to just double check what DJI's site for the RS2 and RSC2 to list what compatibility and what other capabilities you have. Some cameras I know can take power over USB to run the camera, as well as, I mean, it uses your gimbal battery. But I believe you also still have the basic actual control functionality, so iris, focus, things like that, while you're using it, yeah. So yeah, you have a lot of control with a RS2 or an RSC2. Let's see here. What's the lowest VFR on the GH6? The 2 FPS was great on the GH5, but I would like to see lower. Great for time lapses. Yeah, so the GH6 does add the ability, if I go back into video and come in here, go into variable frame rate, turn this on. You do now have a 1 frame per second option available. So in each of the output frame rates, you do have the ability to do 1 FPS. Depending on the frame rate that you choose is where your upper limit will change. So full HD 24p is where you can get 300 frames per second. If I come in here and change this to, say, let's do 4K 24, which the other nice benefit with variable frame rate is that there's all intra options as well and higher bitrate available too. So like 4K 24p all intra 422 is a 400 megabit. It's the same 400 megabit that we've been using in previous 4K 60p's, in this case 4K 24p. And when I come into here to frame rate, you'll see that if I turn this on, I can do up to 60 because it's 10-bit all I. But I still have that 1 frame per second option as well. So you get that ability to do 10-bit footage, so you can shoot log more confidently in variable frame rate. And you can do the kind of simpler way to do time-lapse recording where it comes out from the camera as a time-lapse. Yeah. Let's see here. Jake asks, just want clarification on the electronically assisted parfocal feature. Does this camera need to be stationary, say on a tripod, for this feature to work properly? No, because the lens is, it's communication between the lens and the camera. So, again, I don't have it sitting on my desk, but a really good example of this is our 50 to 200 2.8 to f4. Zoom that lens out to 200 millimeter, set your focus, in manual focus, zoom back out to 50, and the system uses the information of where the lens is, where the zoom range is, where the focus was, to calculate out the assistance that it needs for the parfocal-like nature. Now, we say this is electronically parfocal, so if you're someone who's worked with like actual mechanically parfocal lenses, you will see a little bit of a difference in the way they work. If you do a really quick zoom, you can force the system to lose it because you're moving really fast, where a mechanically parfocal lens, it's hard mounted the way the elements move together. But for the vast majority of shooting, it's going to do exactly what you need it to. And a large number of lenses support it, yeah. So let's see here. Will increasing the number of focus points via firmware benefit AF, and why do you decide on 315 focus points in the GH6? So focus points versus like previous cameras, and I realize I'm still on the camera screen. So the GH6 has an increase in focus points, and a lot of that comes down to the new sensor and the new processor. Previous cameras, you're not going to see an increase to 315 from 225. But the more points that are available gives the system more areas to read information for focus, so it does help in the improvements over previous gen DFD systems. And yeah, 315, I don't know why 315 was the number that it was settled on. It just is. I can ask. I don't think I'll get an answer. But yeah, I'll ask. Let's see here. Thanks for asking. Thanks for answering question. Really excited for GH6. Really can't stand the full frame backlash the GH6 has. It was meant to magically compete equal to full frame. So this goes to, I think, more of that point of look at the camera that fits your needs. The stream last week, I believe it was last week, we talked about that when we went through the lineup of the LUMIX series cameras. You know, looking at them side by side, you'll see that there are reasons why you'd actually want to go with a GH6 over a full frame camera, even over something like an S1H. Faster frame rates if you need them. If depth of field is something that you're production-wise, you don't need, ultra shallow depth of field, then a Micro Four Thirds camera is going to be infinitely better for that. Stage performances, stuff like that. Yeah, there's just a lot that you get in the smaller, or the crop censored cameras versus full frame because the technology is different in these cameras, especially in the GH6. I mean, it's wildly different technology than what is being used in the full frame sensors. So get you faster readouts, stuff like that, less rolling shutter. But yeah, I'm super stoked that you're excited for GH6. Let's see here. Wanting to shoot 5.7K 30p seems like I'm limited in either H.265 200 megabits per second MOV or ProRes at a very high bitrate instead. Any chance of something between 3 to 400 in H.265? So probably not. But I think one of the things to remember is 200 megabits in HEVC, which is going to be 420 10-bit, is a widely accepted and supported combination of bitrate and bit depth. If you're looking at this compared to, say, like H.264, it's roughly the equivalent of the 400 megabit because it's a more efficient compression. And for those that are very deep in the technical side of this, I know that it's a very oversimplification of HEVC versus H.264. But truthfully, take a look at the H.265 at 200 megabit versus H.264 at 400 megabit. They're both going to be long GOP, so make sure you're looking at close to that kind of file type. And you'll see that image quality-wise, they're going to be fairly similar to each other. So in a case like that, the bitrate might not actually really give you all that much more. If anything, it's going to, again, it will increase the file size. But it's that balance of, does it actually add anything that's, kind of a real benefit to the image? Or is it fairly indistinguishable from what is currently available? To the point about ProRes, yeah, ProRes files are going to be much less compression. They're going to be much higher bit rate. So, I mean, in 5.7K 30, we're talking going up to 1.9 gigabits per second. For those that don't know, a 128 gig CF Express card, that's about 8 minutes, almost 9 minutes of recording. So that's a ton of space. But that's where the USB SSD recording, when we have that firmware update come out, that's where that's going to kind of mitigate some of that for longer form shooting. But yeah, just different options available. Let's see here. GH5 had a little problem with audio that started like a second after the beginning of the video clip, meaning your first frame of the clip was without audio. Is that fixed in GH6? I seem to remember a little bit of that years ago. Obviously years ago because GH5 is 5 years old. I think there was a firmware update that came out that addressed some of that. But I haven't noticed anything on a GH6 when it comes to click record, audio starts, video starts. It's all right there. So, yeah, shouldn't be an issue. Max says, regarding power delivery over USB, is it bad for the battery or camera to, say, keep the camera running over multiple hours? Is this comparable to charging a phone that's already at 100%? So using the newer standards, USB PD, I've run the camera off USB for, I think it was the longest one that I ran was for 26 hours doing a time lapse. And I saw no negative impact to it. Typically, like with batteries in general, any kind of lithium ion battery, a couple of things to just look out for. Don't store them dead. Make sure that they have a charge. Charge them when you need to. And if you're someone who likes to be really cautious on it and really extend the battery life, the lifetime of the battery, not the battery exhaustion life, then maybe, yeah, you want to use it while you need it and then plug in a USB PD charger when you start to get down on the battery. But you shouldn't really have any kind of concern with powering the camera over USB. We've been doing it in cameras for years. And yeah, so it should be fine. I don't think you should have really much of anything to really kind of worry about. Let's hear it. Just want to say that I'm really excited for the possibilities GH6 brings. I think this will be a true game changer in the industry. I like to think so too. Is ProRes an all-I codec? Yeah, it's ProRes will be all intra. So it'll be 422. Let me go in and change my camera to ProRes. Let that cycle through. All right, so right here, so it's ProRes 422. Yeah, so it's an all intra codec. It's just way less compressed, so that's why it's a lot bigger. Let's see here. Does the GH6 have an AA filter found in the S1H? So no, there is no anti-aliasing filter on the GH6. So you get a little bit sharper looking images. As you start to go up higher in resolution, you tend to not need a low-pass filter as often. But yeah, so this camera doesn't have a low-pass filter. Let's see here. Is the current version of the image app compatible with the GH6? Also, does the app support focus transition? So, 2 points on this. One, the image app is not compatible. The image app is the old app that we used to use with like the GH3 era cameras. The LUMIX Sync app is the one that you would use for the camera. As far as focus transition goes, focus transition I do not believe is available in the LUMIX Sync app. Certain things being controlled over the Wi-Fi, I don't think have the control there. But we can ask our app development team if that's something that could be added. Basically, one of the ways to look at it is if it involves going into the menus like a couple levels in to get to the feature, it might not. Or if there's a specific way that it's being activated. So in the GH6, we changed how focus transition is activated, and the way you program each of the 3 points that you can select to hardware buttons on the camera now. So some of that may be why it's not included. I will have to check with the app development team and our engineering team to see, but I will do that, and we will check into it and get back to you on a future stream. Let's see here. Is the color science different than Vlog in the S series? No. So the GH6 utilizes Vlog V gamut. So this is going to be more in line with an S1, S1, S1H, and an S5. So from an editing perspective, it's going to be very similar to that. Every camera usually does have slight tweaks to the image quality or the color rendition. Some of that comes down to the hardware, so the sensor characteristics, the resolution, stuff like that can all change things a little bit. But you will see a difference between like a GH5 Mark II and the GH6, or a GH5S and the GH6. That will have some of the differences there in the image quality. What's awesome is that the community that's developing LUTs out there, you'll see, like, as time goes on, correction LUTs and stuff like that, normalization LUTs that kind of help you bridge different cameras together. So yeah, they'll come out, and you'll eventually see a lot of that stuff. So as far as matching cameras, shouldn't be too big of a deal, but it's gonna respond closer to an S series camera than the previous G series generation cameras. Let's see here. Can anyone drop a link for power banks that support 9-volt 3 amp? Yeah, so who asked that? I don't know if I can pronounce that name. So at the link I just dropped in the chat is the ones that we've been able to test and connect in with the cameras and show that work. And then roughly where you can find them, different regions, because not all models you can get in all countries, that kind of thing. If you're in the US or really in North America, you can pretty much get any of them. But yeah, you've got options there, different wattage, different levels, all that have that 9-volt 3 amp. Let's see here. General question regarding Panasonic lenses for video. Which lenses do support stepless continuous aperture changes? Is there a list or some kind of overview? That's a good question. I don't know if we have an overview of it, but let me double check something here. Focus ring, linear control, shutter button control, operation. Yeah, so it doesn't look like we have an actual, like, formal list of what supports the stepless iris. Basically, if the way I typically say to look is anything that's newer than, say, the 12 to 60 f2.8 to 4 or the 8 to 18 f2.8 to 4. Any lens that's there and newer should have the support for the stepless iris. It's easy to test if you have the ability to go into a store, put a lens on there and test. But pretty much the Leica series lenses are going to support it, and the full frame series lenses all support it as well. Yeah. Let's see here. How about compatibility of this function with Olympus lenses and camera? Not sure which question you were referencing there, Joe Pro. Oh, the stepless iris changes. So stepless iris changing depends on hardware within the lens. So for the vast majority, that's pretty much our lenses. Since we develop them, we know how they work. We know what motors we use. We know what iris control systems we use. Yeah, so as far as that goes, compatibility, that's going to depend on whether or not a lens has it and if that information is being communicated. So as of right now, I know that it's pretty much just ours. Yeah. Let's see here. There was a question I know that I just missed. Micro Four Thirds has low light advantage versus full frame. We think shallower depth of field is better, but deeper can be better. You can shoot 2 stops more light with the same deeper depth of field on Micro Four Thirds versus full frame, which is very helpful for video. Yeah, that's a really good point, Daniel. There's a reason why multiple different formats exist. Not one format's ever going to be perfect for every style of shooting. So look at what your needs are, and you'll be able to determine which one fits the best for you. The GH6 really is one of those cameras that kind of shifts the trend a little bit because of the architecture that this sensor uses and the new processor that's in here, adding a lot of really cool stuff to it and creative ways of expanding things like dynamic range and getting cleaner shadows and more highlight range out of it. So yeah, it's a really solid platform, and it's one of the core reasons why Micro Four Thirds and full frame for us are going to continue to coexist, despite what naysayers want to say online. The system is, there are so many benefits for one over the other, and they help each other in development. So things that you see in the Micro Four Thirds world, and things you see in the full frame world, they help development on both sides of our system. So yeah. Let's hear. Hey Sean, the GH6 seems to have updated color science, universally praised from what I've seen. But is there a way to easily match old colors to the new colors? There can be. That's where using normalization LUTs and kind of getting everything standardized can help you. As more people in the community start working with these cameras and coming up with their own looks and their own styles, I'm sure you're going to see people coming up with systems that allow you to get it to match. And yeah, as Dennis is saying here, it can be relatively easy. Depending on just once more people get the cameras in their hands. That's really what the core is for stuff like that. Yeah. Let's see here. Max asks, you once explained why it's difficult to put an internal ND into a camera. Maybe we'll get a lens adapter with an ND insert someday, like Micro Four Thirds to L mount or even EF Winky Face. So ND throttle adapters do exist to go from lenses designed for a longer flange distance than what you're adapting it to. They do exist. I believe Aperture made one for a little while. They may still make one. There's different adapters that are actually like for out front of matte boxes, stuff like that. Internal ND filters, though, that is where, in general, the industry kind of is at, I'd say, kind of like a not a stuck point, but just a current time where the technology doesn't really exist to miniaturize the hardware needed for internal neutral density filtration, while not having a negative impact in the image when you're not wanting to use it. Existing setups, we've had people ask us, like with the box cameras, why didn't you just put a fixed internal variable ND filter into the camera? And it sounds like a great idea up front. But the thing that you have to remember is that even when that ND filter is turned off, you still have another layer of optics that you have to go through, and it's filtration material. So when it comes to that, you lose light. Think of this as when we go way back to the DSLR era, you had SLTs and SLRs. SLTs would shoot through a translucent mirror to get faster frame rates, faster burst rates, because you didn't have to move a mirror out of the way. The trade-off being that you lost 1 to 2 stops of light through that material, because it still had, in that case, because it still had to reflect light up into an optical viewfinder. Modern systems are fairly similar. They're getting better and better, but size still has that limitation. So when you look at, say, like the BGH1 or a BS1H, if you were to put a neutral density filter in that would need to be moved out of the way, the camera would be nearly double the size, because you have to move an element out of the way that's the same size as the sensor, plus the area around it for the controlling electronics and physical mechanisms. So internal, it gets a little more challenging. When it comes to micro four thirds and L mount, you're not going to see adapters like that. You may not actually ever see an adapter for L mount to micro four thirds or vice versa, mainly because the two flange distances are within 0.75 millimeter of each other, and you have to have electronics being controlling. In some cases, like the L mount is a 20 millimeter flange distance, micro four thirds is 19.25, I believe. The lens would have to sit inside the mount. Vice versa, the L mount would sit 0.75 millimeters out in front of the micro four thirds mount. Where are you going to fit the electronics? That's why you don't see these kinds of adapters. Yeah. Let's see here. Hopefully that answered your question, Max. We would love to see it, but it's just the technology's not there yet. Let's see here. I got time for one more question, and then we're going to call it. So, let's see here. Is there a certified coupler for V-mount solutions, like something from Condor Blue, Zacuto, etc.? No, we don't have certified external couplers, mainly because there's no like standard in that kind of stuff. There's the voltage and watts that the camera needs in the battery, and at that point you're hoping that the conversion electronics and the control boards properly make those step downs in some cases. Probably the best thing that I can say is if you look at the FX Lion, I think they're called the Nano V-Lock batteries or V-mount batteries. Those have a very clever way of working with our systems, in that they have a USB power delivery spec USB-C port on them. So you can have a V-Lock battery mounted up in your rig, have the USB-C cable running into the camera to provide USB power delivery on the 9-volt 3-amp standard, and then use something like DTAP to your external monitor. That's a way that we've actually displayed the cameras at some trade shows. So, here, Tyler asks, going off Max's comment about NDs, would Lumix ever consider just embracing a larger body style to adopt internal NDs? Use an FX6 at work and absolutely worth the trade-off. It's definitely conversations we have. Depending on just really what the design goal of a certain camera is. The box cameras, for those that don't know, this is the first time under the Lumix branding we've made a much more hardcore cinema and broadcast style camera. Usually those were from our Panasonic broadcast division. So you'd see things like Eva, Vericam, things like that. So this is really like one of the first times we've had a camera like this, and we've gotten so much incredible feedback from the community who's actually working with them in the real world that helps us develop Gen 2 of cameras like this. Now, it's getting close to talking about future product plans, but, feedback like that we get, hey, the vast majority of people are like, yeah, we'd love to have this camera. Sure, make it bigger if you can put an ND filter into it. Those kinds of things get into consideration on future generations of products. That's why we do streams like this, because all the feedback that y'all give us helps our engineering team understand what the market wants, what users want, for us to determine if it's something that we can do and actually develop into the next gen of a product. Let's see here. I'm seeing a ton of noise and solid color areas on my GH6 out of the box, and Vlog, Dynamic Range Boost 2000, but also with it at 400 ISO. Advice. Probably the biggest thing is check how you are exposing Vlog. Vlog, any kind of logarithmic profile, you want to make sure you expose them correctly. If you are underexposing, you're most likely introducing noise and other image issues into the file. We offer a ton of tools in the camera, so things like Luminance spot meter, waveform, vector scopes, well, for color. But ultimately, set your midtones to 42 IRE. Or if you're using Luminance spot meter when you have the camera set up in Vlog, which I have on the screen. Oh, that's my focus point. Oh, that's night mode. Oh, I remapped it. Hang on one second. So we're going to go in here. I'm going to program this to get me into Luminance spot meter, if I can remember where it is. This is thrilling internet content, watching me go through a menu. As you can see, even if I work with these cameras day in and day out, I still have to remember exactly where things are. So, Luminance spot meter. So when I turn Luminance spot meter on here, you'll see that because I'm in like 709, I get a percentage view. So right now that's 23%. Realistically, what you would do is you'd set this to 42% when you're in like 709 for a gray card, so for your midtones. When you set that up, that will let you know that your midtones are properly exposed, and if you're lighting your scene, you'll be able to then move this around and say, okay, my shadows are at 16%. My highlight, this isn't really a highlight, but my highlight back here is showing that's 105%, so it's into super white. When I change the camera to Vlog, you'll see that that box changes. That now actually changes to a stop value, so in this case, 2.8 stops. If I bring it down onto the area here, you'll see that this will show up as 2.1 stops. Use those tools to set up your exposure. You want to typically try to protect your highlights when you're shooting in a logarithmic profile. But know that when you use this particular tool, so Luminance spot meter, it gives you the ability to actually overexpose your image to where you're not going to clip your highlights. You know that you have more latitude to pull your highlights back down to get cleaner looking shadows. Those that work much more in depth with color for video, and in the video side, will tell you some of the different kind of trade-offs that you give when you start working that way. But ultimately, yeah, use Luminance spot meter and the tools that are available to help get your exposure proper. And that avoids things like noise in the shadows that may not be what you're looking for. So, let's see here. All right, I got one more question that I can answer, and then I do have to call today. When my C1 custom profile is set as aperture priority stills mode, can I change it to S or M within that profile? Is it possible in video mode? It is possible in video mode, but never an option in stills mode. I don't think you can do that in the C1 custom modes for photography, because they're set up as basically as if you're turning the dial to that mode. So the logic it uses for exposure, for controls, it is set to that mode. Creative movie mode is more of a software change. I mean, it actually is a software change where you can manually go in and say, shutter, aperture, manual, those different priority modes. So yeah, doing the photo mode, it's going to be locked to the mode that you actually save to it. Video does allow you to kind of still change it. It's inherently just the way the system is set up. Let's see here. All right, this is the actual last question. Dave's Nature Production. What's the correct percentage to set zebras in Vlog with dynamic range boost on? So zebras, you're still going to typically want to set your zebras to where it really depends on how you use your zebras, honestly. If you ask a bunch of people, they'll have kind of a different way that they work with zebras. For your highlights, you typically would set your zebras, I believe, at 80%, 80 or 90%, and then be able to do your exposure there. I've adopted using zebras for midtones because you can set dual zebras on the GH6. So I'll set one at 42 plus or minus. This way I know where my midtones are. Or I just use Luminance spot meter now because I think it's a much more efficient tool to make sure that my highlights are properly exposed for. So cool. Thank you, everyone, for all of the awesome questions. If I didn't get to your question, I apologize. We will be back next week. Like I said, we're going to be shifting back towards things like the S5 and conversations like that. But keep the questions coming in the comments after the video. We always do review these. When this video is done and processed, I will go in and review all the chat for questions that I missed. And we will be putting chapters on this video, so you'll be able to jump back to an answer that I give based on a question. And with that, yeah, thank you all so much for tuning in. If you want to continue these conversations, think about giving us a follow over on Instagram. It's one of the other platforms that I interact with everybody on. I do interact over on the Facebook groups too. I'm Sean at LUMIX over on the Facebook groups. I have also started monitoring and jumping in some of the chats over in Reddit. I'm also Sean at LUMIX over there. So if you've got questions and you want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out into those different areas. If you have a question or a topic for a future Lumix Live that you want us to cover, you can always shoot us an email at lumixlive@us.panasonic.com. It'll be on the end screen. And yeah, just a reminder about Lumix Pro services. In the US, we have Red and Platinum. You can follow the QR code or the link lumix-pro.us in the screen that you see here to get information about those. If you haven't done so already, make sure that you either give us a like or subscribe, or maybe both, if you feel that I have earned your like and subscribe for these videos. It helps me out tremendously building these streams and continuing to provide them. We've got a lot of really cool stuff coming up over the next year. We will be at NAB next month. Fingers crossed, everything crossed, just hoping that we can get back out to a show. So if you're going to be at NAB in Las Vegas, was it the last week of April? Be sure to swing by the Panasonic booth. We are, yeah, really excited to get back out. We'll have GH6s there with some really cool setups, so make sure to come join us there. Outside of that, thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great upcoming weekend. And yeah, I look forward to seeing everybody next week, Thursday at 2 p.m. 2 p.m. Eastern time. Take care, everybody. Bye.